The theme kind of for every single April is Light It Up Blue. And so obviously, wearing blue and creating awareness through those types of dress down days. I hope that the corporate Cayman will rise to the challenge and hold some of those. I do know of one event that's slated to happen next Saturday, which would be April the 9th, I believe. And it will be held at 6:30 in the morning at the North Sound Golf Club, formerly Safe Haven. And that would be a fundraising run walk done by the Lighthouse School, and the funds raised through that will go towards purchase of new specialist equipment for the children in the autism class there. From my knowledge, the connection with the color blue comes from the fact that there are many more boys that tend to be diagnosed with autism or autism spectrum disorders than girls. And in fact, I think it's something like 5 times more boys than girls. Autism is a lifelong developmental problem. Starts from birth, although some children may not exhibit noticeable symptoms until 18 months to 2 years, thereabouts. Autism affects language acquisition and development. It affects social interaction, so things like eye contact and the ability to carry on conversations in ways that typically developing children would. And it also, there's quite often the evidence of repetitive or sensory-based behaviors. So in younger children, we might see that in lining up toys, for example, or preoccupation with certain things, obsessions with letters or obsessions with certain cartoon characteristics. In older people, older people on the spectrum, it might just be a special interest, a love of airplanes and timetables, for example. I think it's also very important to remember that when you meet somebody on the spectrum, when you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And just like a rainbow has all kinds of colors and arcs across the sky, so it is with autism and autism spectrum disorders, that there is such a range in terms of severity of presentation in people within their life. So with therapy and with age and development, a person can change in the way that they exhibit their symptoms. So there's changes. There's a spectrum in one's life. There's also the spectrum in terms of one person with autism versus the next one. You might have one person that can't speak verbally but can use pictures, for example, or sign language to communicate. You can have another person that is really had very little impact on their functional language, but socially they still are awkward, as an example. So you have, and then you've got people that are world changers, scientists and musicians from history and even today that are changing our world that probably are on the spectrum. For example, Mozart exhibited many signs of being autistic. They think that Einstein also was on the spectrum. There's a few others, so it's amazing to think that these people that are highly successful in many ways also probably have dealt with challenges that we know nothing about, but yet they've changed our world and made it better. I came home in 2004 after having trained as an occupational therapist in Canada and lived up there for a couple of years and worked in a big children's developmental center. And shortly after I came home and started working at Lighthouse School, I streamed more towards the early intervention side of things, where over time I was able to see the progression and change in referrals that we were receiving from concerned parents and from pediatricians and other clinicians in the community. And just like the rest of the world, I think that every clinician in Cayman would say that yes, our prevalence rate is going up just like everywhere else in the rest of the world. Now they're saying that on average it's about 1 in 88 children that are being diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, which is quite a lot when you think about it. I know that when we first started, when I first came home and I first started with early intervention, there was less awareness and less capability to do the big diagnostic tests here. However, now I'm really pleased to say that many families really don't have to go overseas anymore to get their child diagnosed. If they have a problem, they can raise it with their pediatrician, whether it's at the hospital or whether it's a private pediatrician. We have great clinicians on island now, whether it's psychologists or doctors, occupational therapists, speech therapists, physiotherapists, you name it. I think that the treatment is here, behavior therapists. It's always going to be a system to navigate, and I think that that's an area that we need to continue to work on, to streamline it so that families are able to navigate that system more easily, whether it's accessing therapy for their child or whether it's, helping them become more integrated within the educational system and providing the support necessary for that. So those are our next steps, the streamlining, the working together, the different ministries working together. It started, but we still have a ways to go. We've got our national disability policy passed now, and within government, I can speak to that the various ministries are working to implement the action plans therein. I know that even within the Ministry of Education, there's continued work on our education legislation and updating that, and also work on updating our special education needs code of practice. So I talked about earlier, the streamlining the process to make sure that help is equitable and available to families. We're working on that. I think within the community, I think there's also increased awareness and acceptance for our younger adults and school leavers with special needs. For example, now where I am down at Sunrise Centre, our vocational program works to place young adults with special needs in jobs. And we've had some really great success stories with our internships this year, and hopefully those are going to turn into paid positions any day now. We're working on it. And so I really applaud the accepting and inclusive employers that are out there. And I think that time will show, as it has with many of our other clients for many years, that sometimes people with special needs are some of your best employees. In terms of acceptance, I think that because of the increased prevalence rates with autism in particular, I think that it's less odd perhaps than it once was to see children out in the community behaving differently than what we would expect. It's still really difficult for families that do have children on the spectrum, and I can speak from experience because my son is also on the spectrum. He's 5 now, and he is wonderful, but he can be exhausting and he can be quite a handful. But certainly I wouldn't keep him home. We try to integrate him into every aspect of our lives. So yes, I think we're coming along. We've also got the disability legislation, which is due to be tabled, fingers crossed, very soon, within the year. I know that right now in the international research community there's a lot of interesting research going on. And of course we're finding out more all the time about our brains and the way that we work. I can tell you what I know it's not. And even when I say that I know it's not this, I'm sure that other people that are listening today will say, well, Kim, you don't know that, and I believe differently. But science has pretty much proven, it's debunked that theory that it's linked to vaccines. So I would encourage families to not put credence in that, and to vaccinate your children, because the risk of communicable diseases worldwide is much more devastating. But in terms of what does cause it, I do think that it's a multifactorial thing. I think it's a mix between, there are genetic components of it. There are also environmental components of it, whether that's within the uterus before the child is born or afterwards, exposure to certain things. I think that they're starting to kind of tease out some of that. My personal theory, for what it's worth, is that I think that autism eventually will be kind of like the flu. Every year people get the flu, but there are many different viruses that cause it, and you end up with something that looks the same, but the underlying cause is different. And I suspect, this is just Kim's theory, I suspect that there may be 7, 8, 9, 10 causes for autism, and so two children can both have that same label, but the causes may be very different, in which case then the treatment, what they respond to, likely is going to be different, which is why, when you think about some of the treatments that are on offer for children, the gluten-free, casein-free diet, not every child responds to that, for example. So why is that? If it was one cause for autism, then chances are you would have an array of treatments that would work equally or fairly equally for all children. So I think that there is, in a nutshell, I think that there's a lot of great research going on. I think that in the next 10 years we will find out some really good things. But having said that, I do think that children with autism and people with autism are a blessing to our community. We talked about some of the people historically that have made amazing changes for our lives and our world that are on the spectrum. I think that the world would be very boring and very backwards if we were all the same. And so I think that it's important to be aware and obviously to help people with autism become as independent and as functional as possible, but also to celebrate their unique strengths and their amazing intelligence and wonderful skills and the gifts that they have and the way that they can contribute to Cayman and to our world.